Hargrove's heavy hand violently strikes Amara across the face, ending the argument with brutal force right in the middle of a crowded cafe lobby.
Know your place, you arrogant black woman!
Hargrove sneers, leaning in close, his voice dripping with venomous contempt.
You think because you wear a nice coat, you can talk down to me? You're nothing but a loudmouth nobody who doesn't belong in this room. Now get out of my sight before I really lose my temper.
Amara doesn't cry. She simply turns to leave. The cafe lights catching her silver necklace, revealing a small orange and white MSF badge. 4 meters away, James Calloway spots the badge, and the air is instantly sucked out of his lungs. His face goes completely pale.
Sir, do you have any idea who you just hit?
I don't care.
You don't understand. They'll come for you.
Let them try.
Hargrove scoffs, letting out an arrogant laugh.
I don't give a damn who she is.
That laugh is the absolute last mistake of his career. He has no clue he just assaulted a top-ranking Doctors Without Borders official with the power to ruin his entire life. What happens when a corrupt billionaire messes with the wrong woman? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that subscribe button, and stay tuned for the ultimate takedown. The alarm on Dr. Amara Osei's phone went off at 5:15 every morning, and every morning she silenced it before the second vibration, already awake. She had learned to sleep lightly in Afghanistan. 9 months in Kandahar with Doctors Without Borders had recalibrated something fundamental in her nervous system, the part that decided when rest was safe and when the world required your full attention. 17 years later, back in Chicago, in a one-bedroom apartment on the south side with a radiator that knocked through the winter nights and a window that overlooked a parking lot, her body still operated on that setting. Alert before the alarm, present before the day demanded it. She was at the clinic by 6. The Southside Community Health Center occupied the ground floor of a building that had once been a hardware store, its conversion to medical use still visible in the industrial ceiling and the wide concrete floor that no amount of linoleum could fully disguise. Amara had been its medical director for 4 years, following a position as a research biochemist at the University of Illinois that had ended badly, quietly, and in ways she had spent the years since carefully documenting. The clinic served patients who had nowhere else to go. Uninsured construction workers, elderly residents whose Medicare gaps left entire categories of medication uncovered, young mothers navigating a healthcare system that had been designed, it sometimes seemed, specifically to exhaust people until they gave up. Amara did not give up on any of them. She had seen worse than an insurance denial form. She had worked in a tent in the Kandahar heat with no electricity and a generator that failed twice a week, and she had kept people alive anyway. The MSF badge on her silver necklace had been with her since those 9 months. A small thing, orange and white, the size of a thumbnail, worn smooth at the edges from years of handling. She did not wear it as a credential or a conversation piece. She wore it because it reminded her of the specific weight of what was possible when a person decided that a stranger's life mattered as much as their own comfort. She had never talked about Kandahar in any interview. She had never mentioned it in any grant application. The people who needed to know, knew. Everyone else did not need to. Richard Hargrove's morning began at 7:30 in the penthouse of the Meridian Tower, with a view of Lake Michigan that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a year. He was 52 years old, gray at the temples, built with the deliberate fitness of a man who understood that physical presence was a form of professional leverage. He had run Meridian Pharmaceuticals for 11 years, taking a mid-sized regional drug company and expanding it into one of the most profitable pharmaceutical operations in the Midwest. His methods were not universally admired. His results were impossible to argue with, which was the only metric he had ever respected. In 3 weeks, Meridian was going public. The IPO had been in preparation for 18 months, a $4.2 billion valuation anchored largely by a single drug in their portfolio, a diabetes treatment called MRD7, which analysts had described as the most significant advance in affordable insulin-independent therapy in a decade. It was the crown jewel of Hargrove's empire, the drug that had transformed Meridian from a profitable company into a landmark one. He did not think about where MRD7 had come from. He had not thought about it in years. A legal team handled acquisitions. A research division handled development. Hargrove handled outcomes. That division of attention had served him extremely well for a very long time. His schedule that morning included a breakfast meeting with 3 investment bankers and a media briefing at 10. His assistant had booked a table at Copper Hall, a cafe in the financial district directly below the Meridian Tower, chosen for its discretion and the quality of its espresso. James Calloway had his own vehicle in the parking garage by 6:45, running the morning security check the way he ran it every day, methodically and without shortcuts. He was 55 years old, former United States Army, 17 years in military service before transitioning to private security work. He had worked for Hargrove for 6 years, long enough to understand his employer's temperament precisely, to anticipate the moments when Hargrove's impatience would sharpen into something that required management. James was good at his job. He was thorough and calm and professional in all the ways that mattered for the work. But there was a part of him that existed entirely outside of his professional life, a part that he carried every single day without ever setting it down. His son Danny had been 22 years old when his unit was hit outside Kandahar in the spring of 2006. A roadside device, a collapsed vehicle, and a forward operating base medical tent that was understaffed by 2 surgeons on the night it mattered most. Danny had survived, against every reasonable probability, because a civilian volunteer physician had been present in that tent by what could only be described as the grace of an itinerary that placed her exactly there at exactly that hour. Danny had described her to James so many times over the 17 years since that the description had become a kind of family prayer, repeated until every detail was fixed permanently in place. A black woman, calm beyond any calm Danny had ever seen in a person under pressure. A small scar on her left cheekbone from a previous deployment, hands that did not shake. And on her chest, visible even under the protective vest she wore, a small orange and white badge that Danny had learned later was the emblem of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. I would recognize that badge anywhere, Danny had told his father once, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man describing the face of someone who had given him back his life, even in the dark, even across a room. James had searched for her, quietly and persistently, for years. He had contacted MSF's administrative offices twice, receiving responses that cited privacy protocols and the organization's policy against disclosing volunteer information without consent. He had reached out to other veterans from Danny's unit, finding only fragments of the same story he already knew. He had eventually accepted, with the particular grief of an unanswered question, that he might never find her. That morning, he drove Richard Hargrove to Copper Hall for a 7:55 breakfast meeting, parked the vehicle, and took his standard position near the entrance. He had his coffee in hand, and his eyes on the room the way they always were, monitoring without appearing to monitor, present without intruding. He did not notice the woman in the plain gray coat sitting near the window until the moment everything in the room shifted and the sound of a palm striking a face cut through the morning noise of the cafe like a blade. And then he saw the necklace and the badge, and 17 years collapsed into a single second. Amara had arrived at Copper Hall at 7:40, 15 minutes early the way she arrived everywhere, not out of anxiety but out of respect for other people's time, a habit formed in field medicine where being late could mean something irreversible. She ordered black coffee, no sugar, and took the table nearest the window, setting her bag on the chair beside her and removing a folder of documents she had reviewed so many times that the edges had gone soft. Inside were 4 years of carefully assembled legal research, patent filings, correspondence records, and a timeline that Eleanor Tran had helped her build over the past 2 years into something that could withstand scrutiny in a federal courtroom. Eleanor was due at 8:15. They had agreed on this cafe specifically because it was located directly beneath Meridian Tower, a choice that was not accidental. Amara had learned from her time in conflict zones that there was a particular kind of clarity that came from standing close to the thing you were confronting, close enough to see it clearly without the distortion of distance. She sipped her coffee and looked out at the street, watching the city move through its morning rhythms. She was not nervous. She had been nervous 4 years ago, when the idea of challenging a $4.2 billion pharmaceutical company with a folder of documents and a salary that barely covered her clinic's operating costs had seemed genuinely impossible. She had spent those 4 years converting the impossibility into a case. The nervousness had burned off somewhere in the middle of that process, replaced by something quieter and more durable. She was ready. The door opened at 7:53, and the temperature of the room changed. Amara did not look up immediately. She had learned not to react to the atmospheric shifts that powerful men created when they entered spaces, the subtle reorganization of everyone else's posture and attention that announced a person who expected the room to accommodate itself to their presence. She had seen it in military commanders. She had seen it in hospital administrators. She had seen it in the kinds of men who sat across negotiating tables from organizations like MSF and decided how much aid was politically convenient to allow. She recognized the type without needing to identify the individual. What she heard next made her look up. A barista, young and visibly flustered by the sudden arrival of an entourage, had collided with a colleague near the espresso station. The sound of jostling equipment was followed by the specific silence that precedes an accident, and then the soft, spreading sound of liquid finding fabric. Amara was already reaching for the napkin dispenser on her table when the voice hit her. It was not the words at first. It was the register, the absolute certainty of a man who had not been contradicted in so long that he had lost the capacity to consider it possible. "That was careless and stupid," the voice said, and from its direction and its volume, Amara understood immediately that it was not addressed to the barista who had caused the spill. It was addressed to her. She set down the napkin and looked at Richard Hargrove for the first time. He was already focused on her with the complete conviction of a man who had made a decision in the half-second between perceiving a problem and identifying its cause. He had seen her nearest to him when the coffee landed. That was sufficient. The gray coat, the worn bag, the folder of documents on the table, none of it registered as evidence requiring further evaluation. She was simply the most convenient explanation, and convenience had always been enough for Richard Hargrove. "I did not touch your coffee," Amara said. Her voice was level and clear. "The spill came from behind the counter. You can ask your assistant, who was standing directly behind you and saw the same thing I did." Hargrove's expression shifted from irritation to something colder. The calm in her voice had not been what he expected, and the unexpected always made him dangerous. "Are you telling me what I saw?" he said. "I am telling you what happened," Amara replied. "They are the same thing." The cafe had gone quiet in the particular way that spaces go quiet when the people inside them sense that something is about to exceed the normal boundaries of a public disagreement. Heads turn carefully, the way people turn when they want to watch without appearing to watch, calibrating how visible their attention should be. Hargrove's two assistants exchanged a glance but said nothing. James had taken a step forward from his position near the entrance, reading his employer's posture the way he had learned to read it over 6 years, calculating whether intervention was required and what form it should take. "Do you know who I am?" Hargrove said. It was the question powerful men asked when they had run out of arguments and needed to reestablish the hierarchy by other means. Amara looked at him steadily. It does not change what happened. Something closed off behind Hargrove's eyes. The conversation, in his assessment, had gone on considerably longer than it deserved, and the woman across from him showed no sign of providing him with the apology or the retreat that would allow him to move on with his morning. He leaned forward slightly. "You think because you wear a nice coat you can talk to me like that?" His voice had dropped, which made it carry further in the silent room. "You have no idea what I can do to people like you with a single phone call." Amara did not move. "You are welcome to make whatever calls you like," she said. "But you should know that the spill came from your left, not from me, and any staff member in this room will confirm that if asked." It was the last sentence she completed before his hand moved. The sound of the strike reached the back of the cafe before the image of it fully registered for most of the people watching. A flat, sharp crack that belonged in a different kind of room entirely. Not here, not in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday morning, in a coffee shop full of people going about ordinary lives. Amara's head turned slightly from the force of it. She did not make a sound. For 3 full seconds, nobody in Copper Hall moved or spoke or appeared to breathe. The only sound was the ambient hiss of the espresso machine, which had not been informed that the world had just shifted on its axis. Then Amara straightened her back, lifted her chin, and looked directly into Richard Hargrove's eyes with an expression so composed that several witnesses would later describe it, independently and using almost identical words, as the most unsettling thing they had ever seen on another person's face. "You have no idea," she said quietly, "what you just walked into." She picked up her bag from the chair beside her. She left the folder on the table, deliberately, the way a person leaves something they intend to return for. and she turned and walked toward the door with the unhurried steadiness of someone who had already decided, long before this morning, exactly what she was going to do next. James moved before he fully understood why. That was the only way he could explain it afterward. To Danny, to Eleanor Tran, to the federal investigator who would ask him months later to reconstruct the sequence of events in that cafe with as much precision as he could manage. He had not made a conscious decision to follow her. His body had simply understood something that his mind was still catching up to, and his legs had carried him through the cafe door and onto the sidewalk before the sound of the strike had finished echoing inside the room. The morning air outside Copper Hall was cold and bright, the kind of October clarity that made everything look slightly more defined than usual, edges sharper, distances more precise. The financial district moved around him with its ordinary indifference, taxis and pedestrians, and the distant percussion of a construction site 2 blocks north. Amara was 20 feet ahead of him, walking at the same unhurried pace she had used, leaving the cafe, her gray coat moving around her in the wind off the lake. She had not broken stride. She had not looked back. James caught up to her in 6 steps. "Excuse me," he said. She stopped, not with surprise, but with the particular stillness of someone who had been expecting to be followed and had already decided how to handle it. She turned to face him, and James saw for the first time in full the face that Danny had described to him across a kitchen table in Evanston on a Sunday afternoon 17 years ago. The scar on her left cheekbone, small, pale, curved, the kind of mark left by shrapnel from a distance, close enough to cut but not close enough to kill. His chest contracted. "I'm sorry to stop you," James said. His voice was not the voice he used for professional situations, controlled and measured. It was something rawer than that, something that had bypassed the professional layer entirely and come from somewhere much older. "I need to ask you something, and I understand if you don't want to answer." Amara looked at him with the calm assessment of a person accustomed to being approached by strangers in difficult circumstances. Her eyes moved briefly to his jacket, to the earpiece, to the stance that identified him as security without requiring a uniform. She said nothing, waiting. James reached into the part of his memory where he had kept the details Danny gave him. The specific details, the ones that could not be reconstructed from general knowledge of the region or the organization. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind for years, never expecting it to arrive, always carrying it anyway. He said a phrase in Pashto, not a greeting, not a common expression. A specific line from a specific protocol used by MSF, field volunteers working in active conflict zones in Kandahar province during a specific operational period in 2005 and 2006, a line that Danny had overheard from the entrance of the medical tent and had repeated to his father with the faithful accuracy of a man preserving something precious. The phrase meant, approximately, "The generator is down, but we are not going anywhere." It had been the volunteer physician's response to the base commander when the power failed during Danny's surgery, and the commander had suggested they suspend the procedure until conditions improved. She had said it in Pashto, Danny told James once, because the local staff needed to hear it too. She needed everyone in that tent to know we were not stopping. Amara went completely still, not the stillness of someone hearing something unfamiliar, the stillness of someone hearing something they had not expected to encounter on a sidewalk in Chicago on a Tuesday morning 17 years after the last time those words had mattered. She looked at James with an expression that had not been on her face inside the cafe. Not the composed, deliberate calm she had maintained through Hargrove's escalation in the strike itself. Something different. Something that moved underneath the surface of her features like a change in the depth of water. She answered him, in Pashto, the correct response. The one that followed in the protocol, the one that only someone who had been in that tent would know. James's hands began to shake. He had not cried in front of another person since the night the hospital in Landstuhl had called to tell him that Danny was out of surgery and expected to recover. He did not cry now, but it was a near thing, and the effort of maintaining composure required more of him in that moment than most of the genuinely dangerous situations he had navigated in the 6 years he had worked for Richard Hargrove. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone with fingers that were not entirely steady. He found Danny's number and pressed call, turning slightly away from Amara as though the partial privacy of a turned shoulder could contain what he was feeling. Danny picked up on the second ring. "Dad?" It was early still, Danny's voice carrying the particular texture of someone who had been awake for hours. He was always awake early. that had not changed since Kandahar. James kept his voice as level as he could manage. "I need you to listen to me carefully," he said. The scar on her left cheekbone, small, pale, curved toward the jaw. Silver necklace. MSF badge, orange and white. Black coat, worn at the cuffs. Hands completely still, even when she was hit. A silence on the line that lasted exactly 4 seconds. "Dad." Danny's voice had changed entirely. "Where are you right now?" "Outside Copper Hall." "Financial district." "She is standing in front of me." Another silence. Longer this time. James could hear his son breathing. "That's her," Danny said. The voice was very quiet and absolutely certain. The way Danny's voice got when he was not performing certainty, but simply reporting it. "Dad, that's her. I know it." James lowered the phone for a moment and looked at Amara, who had been watching him with an expression he could not fully read, patient and contained, and carrying something behind it that he suspected was not patience at all, but simply the very long practice of keeping things that mattered most in a place where they could not be reached by circumstances. "My son's name is Danny Calloway," James said. "He was in Kandahar in the spring of 2006. Forward operating base. Medical tent. April 14th. He watched her face. Something shifted in it. Not much, but enough." "I know," Amara said. 2 words. "Carrying 17 years. James nodded once, slowly, the way a person nods when they have been waiting so long to hear something that the hearing of it does not feel like an arrival so much as a recognition. He brought the phone back to his ear. "She remembers you," he told his son. On the other end of the line, Danny Calloway, 29 years old, a construction foreman in Evanston who coached youth basketball on weekends and called his father every Sunday without fail, made a sound that James had not heard from him since he was a child. James stood on the sidewalk outside Copper Hall. His employer still inside the cafe, 17 years of an unanswered question finally answered, and felt the specific weight of a debt that had just become possible to repay. He looked at Amara. "There is something you need to know," he said, "about what my employer is about to face and about what I am going to do about it." Inside Copper Hall, Richard Hargrove had already moved on. That was the most precise way to describe it. He had not processed what happened, weighed it, and decided to set it aside. He had simply moved on, the way a man moves through a room when he has never once been required to carry the consequences of his own behavior beyond the moment it occurred. He was back at his table. His assistants had produced a replacement jacket from somewhere, and his espresso had been remade and placed in front of him with the silent efficiency of staff who understood that their continued employment depended on making the inconvenient invisible as quickly as possible. The other customers in Copper Hall had not moved on. They sat with the particular stillness of people who had witnessed something they could not unfeel. Conversations resumed in lower registers, eyes that returned involuntarily to the door through which Amara had walked, to the table near the window, where her folder still sat exactly where she had left it. A young woman in a green coat near the back had her phone face down on the table and her hands clasped on top of it, and anyone paying attention could have seen that she was working very hard to maintain an expression of ordinary composure over something that was not ordinary at all. Her name was Sophia Reyes. She was 26 years old, a junior paralegal at a downtown firm, and she had been sitting in Copper Hall since 7:30 because the coffee was good and the Wi-Fi was reliable, and she liked to work through her morning before reaching the office. She had filmed the entire confrontation from the moment Hargrove's voice had risen above the ambient noise of the cafe. Instinctively, the way her generation had been trained by years of witnessing consequential moments in public spaces. She had captured everything: the escalation, the words, the strike, and Amara's response. 47 seconds of footage that was already uploaded to her phone's cloud storage before Hargrove had finished ordering his replacement espresso. She had not posted it yet. She was thinking about what it meant to post it and what it meant not to, and her hands remained on top of her face-down phone while she worked through that question with the seriousness it deserved. In the corner office on the 31st floor of Meridian Tower, directly above the cafe where her CEO had just struck a customer across the face, Priya Sharma was reviewing the final pre-IPO disclosure documents when her assistant knocked and opened the door without waiting for a response, which was sufficiently unusual that Priya set down her pen before the door was fully open. Her assistant was 24 years old and had the specific pallor of someone who had just seen something on a screen that they did not know how to process. She held out her phone without speaking. Priya took it. The video was 31 seconds in when Priya recognized Richard Hargrove's profile. By 47 seconds, she had seen everything. She watched it twice, her expression not changing, her legal training, keeping her face in neutral, while the part of her brain responsible for catastrophic risk assessment went to work at a speed that precluded any other cognitive activity. Then she set the phone down on her desk and opened the IPO filing binder to the section on material litigation risks. She turned to page 47, subsection C, Patent Acquisition Disclosures. MRD 7. Acquired through Institutional Transfer Agreement, University of Illinois, 2017. Original Research Designation, OSE et al. Priya had reviewed this section 14 times during the preparation process. She had reviewed it as a legal formality, as a compliance checkbox, as one line among hundreds of lines that constituted the architecture of a $4.2 billion public offering. She had never, until this moment, looked up the name. She typed it into the legal database on her computer. Dr. Amara Ose, University of Illinois Department of Biochemistry, 2013 to 2018. Published research in diabetes treatment, insulin-independent therapy mechanisms, institutional patent transfer, 2017, MRD7 foundational compound. Compensation, $8,000 standard institutional rate. Priya sat with that number for a moment. $8,000. For the compound that anchored a $4.2 billion valuation. She scrolled further. A note in the legal file from 2018, flagged during a routine audit and subsequently deprioritized. Original researcher expressed concerns regarding terms of transfer agreement. No independent legal counsel present at signing. Institutional review recommended. No follow-up documented. Priya closed the database. She sat very still for 30 seconds, which was 29 seconds longer than she normally allowed herself for stillness during business hours. Then she picked up her phone and called the head of Meridian's legal team. "We have a problem," she said when he answered. "A significant one, and I need you in my office in 10 minutes, because there are things in the MRD7 acquisition file that should have been flagged 2 years ago and were not, and the woman whose name is on the original research just appeared in a video that is currently being shared online with Richard Hargrove's hand across her face." The silence on the other end of the line lasted 4 seconds. "How bad is the video?" he asked. "Bad enough that I have watched it twice and I am still watching it," Priya said. "Get up here." On the sidewalk outside Copper Hall, Amara and James had moved away from the cafe entrance to a space between two parked vehicles where the foot traffic thinned enough to allow a conversation that did not require competing with the noise of the street. James had told her about Danny in the direct, unembellished way of a man who had rehearsed the story so many times that the telling of it had been stripped down to its essential structure. The date, the location, the medical tent, the procedure, the phrase in Pashto, the recovery, the 17 years of looking for her afterward without success. Amara had listened without interrupting, her eyes steady on his face, her hands quiet at her sides. When he finished, she was silent for a moment. "How is he?" she asked. James's composure, which had been holding by a narrowing margin since the moment she had answered him in Pashto, slipped slightly. "He is good," James said. "He is very good. He coaches basketball. He calls me every Sunday." Amara nodded, and James saw in her face something that was not quite relief, because it was older and more settled than relief. Something closer to the satisfaction of knowing that a thing you did in a difficult moment had continued existing in the world in good shape, even when you were not there to see it. "He has been trying to find you," James said. "We both have." "I know," Amara said simply. "I am not easy to find. That has generally been intentional." James looked at her, then at the cafe door behind them, through which his employer was visible at his table, already deep in conversation with his investment bankers. The morning reorganized around his convenience with its usual efficiency. "There is something else you need to know," James said, "about Meridian, about the drug they are taking public." Amara's expression shifted in a way that was very small and very specific. The particular alteration of a face that is receiving information it already possesses being delivered by someone who does not yet know that. "Tell me," she said, not because she needed to hear it, but because she understood that James needed to say it, and that this too was part of what the morning required of both of them. 2 blocks away, in the lobby of the building that housed Eleanor Tran's law offices, Eleanor stepped out of the elevator at 8:12, 3 minutes ahead of schedule, and checked her phone. The video had been sent to her by 4 separate contacts in the previous 11 minutes. She watched it once, standing in the lobby with her briefcase at her side and her coat still buttoned from the cold outside. Then she called Amara. Amara picked up on the first ring. "I saw it," Eleanor said. "Are you all right?" "I am fine," Amara said. "Where are you?" "Outside the cafe. There is someone here you should meet." Eleanor looked at the video on her phone one more time, at the 47 seconds of footage that had already been viewed 240,000 times and was accelerating. "I am coming to you," she said. "And Amara, we are filing today." A pause on the line. "I know," Amara said. Eleanor Tran walked fast. She had always walked fast, a habit formed over 30 years of litigation work, in which the distance between where you were and where you needed to be was rarely sufficient, and the time available to cover it was always less than you wanted. She covered the 2 blocks between her office building and Copper Hall in 4 minutes, her briefcase in one hand and her phone in the other, reading the share count on the video as she moved. 380,000 views. By the time she reached the sidewalk outside the cafe, it was 412,000. She spotted Amara immediately, standing between 2 parked vehicles with a broad-shouldered man in a dark jacket whose posture identified him as security before anything else did. Eleanor slowed her pace for the final 20 feet, reading the scene the way she read every scene she walked into professionally, assessing what had already happened and what it meant for what came next. Amara made the introduction simply. "Eleanor, this is James Calloway. He works for Hargrove. James, this is Eleanor Tran. She is my attorney." James looked at Eleanor with the careful assessment of a man recalibrating a situation in real time. "An attorney. Here. Already." Eleanor looked back at him with the expression she used in depositions when a witness said something that confirmed exactly what she had suspected. Then she turned to Amara. "How long has he known?" Eleanor asked, meaning how long had James known who Amara was. "Since the badge," Amara said. Eleanor processed this. Then she looked at James directly. She had a way of looking at people that had nothing aggressive in it and nonetheless communicated that she was reading considerably more than their surface. "How much do you know about what your employer's company did with her research?" James's jaw tightened. "She just told me. Some of it." Eleanor nodded once, the small, decisive nod of a person organizing information into a structure that would be useful later. Then she turned back to Amara. "I want to go inside. I want to get your folder, and I want to do it now, while he is still in there." Amara looked at the cafe door. The folder was still on the table by the window. She had left it there deliberately, and Eleanor understood that deliberateness, the way she understood most of Amara's choices over the 2 years they had worked together, as something that had been considered and decided long before the moment required it. She had not left the folder because she forgot it. She had left it because she intended to go back. All 3 of them went inside. The temperature in Copper Hall shifted again when they entered, in the same way it had shifted when Hargrove arrived, but differently, a different kind of attention reorganizing itself around a different kind of arrival. Several customers recognized Amara immediately, the woman from the video, and the recognition moved through the room in a quiet wave of stilled conversations and redirected eyes. Hargrove was at his center table with 2 investment bankers and his senior assistant, deep in the kind of conversation that involved documents and lowered voices and the specific body language of men discussing large numbers. He did not look up when the door opened. His assistant did. She clocked Amara's return with the trained peripheral awareness of someone whose job required monitoring her employer's environment for developing problems. She saw the woman from the video walking back into the cafe. She saw the briefcase-carrying woman beside her who had the particular bearing of a person who was about to say something in a professional capacity. She saw James Calloway entering behind them, and the expression on James's face, which was not the expression he wore when everything was under control. She leaned toward Hargrove and said something in a voice too low for the room to catch. Hargrove looked up. His eyes found Amara first, then Eleanor, then James, and what it was currently reading was not a register Hargrove had seen before. He pushed his chair back slightly, but did not stand. Amara walked to the table near the window and picked up her folder without looking at Hargrove. Calm, deliberate, unhurried. The action of someone collecting something that belonged to them from a place they had every right to be. Eleanor set her briefcase on the adjacent table, opened it, and removed a single document, which she placed beside Amara's folder with the careful positioning of someone setting down something that had been prepared for this specific surface. Hargrove's voice came from across the room, carrying the controlled authority of a man who had not yet accepted that the morning had moved beyond his management. "We don't have anything to discuss," he said. "Whatever your attorney wants to tell me, she can communicate through my legal team." Eleanor looked at him for the first time. She had the kind of face that revealed nothing without choosing to, and what she chose to reveal now was a very specific form of professional patience. The kind that contained within it the complete absence of urgency, because the person wearing it understood that time was no longer working in the other party's favor. "That's fine," Eleanor said pleasantly. "Your legal team will be receiving our filing within the hour. I simply wanted to ensure that you were present when Dr. Osei retrieved her property and that there were sufficient witnesses to confirm she did so without incident." The two investment bankers had stopped pretending to review their documents. Hargrove's eyes moved from Eleanor to Amara, to the folder in Amara's hands, and back to Eleanor. Something was assembling itself behind his expression, a recognition that the pieces of the morning were connecting into a shape he had not anticipated, but his certainty had not broken yet. It was bending, not broken. "Whatever claim you think you have," Hargrove said, his voice dropping into the register he used for terminating conversations, "you should know that my company has a legal department with more resources than you have seen in your entire career." Eleanor smiled. It was a small smile, and it did not reach the part of her face that was paying attention to Richard Hargrove. "I have been in patent litigation for 30 years, Mr. Hargrove," she said. "I am aware of what large legal departments look like." She closed her briefcase. "I am also aware that the foundational patent for MRD7 was transferred from Dr. Beck's Osei under an institutional agreement that did not include independent legal counsel for the originating researcher, a fact documented in your own company's acquisition files, and that Meridian's legal team identified this as a potential liability in 2018 and chose not to act on it." The room was very quiet. The investment bankers were no longer looking at their documents at all. Hargrove's assistant had her phone in her hand under the table, and she was typing with the rapid, invisible motion of someone communicating information to someone who needed to receive it immediately. "We will be in touch through the appropriate channels," Hargrove said. His voice had not changed in volume or register, but something had left it. A quality that had always been present before, the absolute certainty of a man speaking from a position that nothing could touch. "Of course," Eleanor said. She picked up her briefcase. She nodded to James, who had been standing near the door throughout the exchange, and then to Amara, who had not looked at Hargrove once since entering the cafe. They left together, the three of them, through the same glass door Amara had used 40 minutes earlier. Behind them, in the 31st floor office directly above, Priya Sharma's phone rang. It was the head of Meridian's legal team. "The filing just came through," he said. "Federal court. Patent invalidity challenge, inequitable conduct claim, unjust enrichment. She is asking for full reversion of MRD7 rights plus damages." "How strong is it?" Priya asked. He paused for a moment that lasted precisely long enough to tell her everything she needed to know before he answered. "Strong enough that I think we need to call the board before we call the IPO underwriters," he said. Priya looked out her window at the street below, where three people were walking away from the entrance to Copper Hall, one of them in a gray coat, moving with the same unhurried steadiness she had seen in the video that was now approaching 1.2 million views. "Call the board," Priya said. "I will handle Richard." Eleanor's office was on the 14th floor of a building 3 blocks north of Copper Hall, a space that reflected 30 years of practice in the specific way that working offices reflect long careers, not through display but through accumulation. Bookshelves that had run out of shelf space and begun colonizing the floor. Filing cabinets whose labels had been updated so many times, the original categories were visible underneath like geological strata. A window that looked out at nothing particularly scenic and had a plant on its sill that had survived 30 years of irregular watering through what Eleanor described as sheer legal stubbornness. Amara sat across from Eleanor's desk in the chair she had occupied dozens of times over the past 2 years. James sat in the second chair, which had been brought in from the small conference room next door, and he sat in it with the careful uprightness of a man who was aware that he was a guest in a space whose rules he did not yet fully understand. Eleanor had the filing confirmation on her screen. Federal Court, Northern District of Illinois, logged at 9:47 in the morning. She had spent 2 years preparing that document, and watching it move from her drafting folder to the court's docketing system had produced in her not the satisfaction she had anticipated, but something quieter and more complicated. The particular feeling of a long-held breath finally released. She looked at Amara. "Tell him," Eleanor said. "All of it. He should understand what he is in the middle of." Amara looked at James for a moment, reading him the way she read patience. Not for what they said, but for what their body communicated underneath the saying. He was steady. Whatever the morning had cost him emotionally, he had put it somewhere contained and was operating from the part of himself that was still functional. She respected that. She understood it. It was the same management strategy she had been using since 7:53 that morning. She began. The research that became MRD7 had started as her doctoral thesis at the University of Illinois, she told him. A compound targeting insulin receptor sensitivity in patients with type 2 diabetes, designed specifically for delivery in low-resource environments. No refrigeration required. Low production cost. Effective in populations that existing diabetes medications consistently failed to reach because the medications required infrastructure those populations did not have. She had spent 4 years developing it. The work had been funded through a combination of university grants and a small MSF research stipend because MSF had identified her work as potentially significant for their field operations in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. She had published 3 papers. The compound had shown results in preliminary trials that her department chair had described, in writing, as the most promising diabetes research to come out of their program in 15 years. In 2017, the university had approached her about a patent transfer agreement. She had been 31 years old. She was a research biochemist at the junior faculty level, without tenure, without the institutional seniority that produces the kind of professional confidence that makes people read contracts very carefully before signing them. The university had presented the transfer as standard procedure, the normal mechanism through which academic research moved toward commercial development, and the kind of broad application that university labs were not equipped to manage alone. The compensation had been $8,000. She said the number without emphasis, the way you state a fact that has long since been processed and no longer requires the additional weight of tone to communicate its significance. James did not say anything, but his jaw tightened in a way that was visible. There had been no independent legal counsel, Amara continued. The university's attorney had been present. Amara's attorney had not, because Amara had not known she was entitled to one, had not known that the standard procedure being described to her was in fact a negotiation with a party whose interests were not aligned with hers, and had not known that what she was signing away for $8,000 would become the foundational compound of a pharmaceutical product whose commercial value was currently being estimated at $3.1 billion within a prong, $4.2 billion IPO. She paused. I knew within a year what they had done with it, she said. Meridian licensed it from the university 6 months after the transfer. They reformulated the delivery mechanism, which was straightforward chemistry, and they rebranded the compound. Everything essential about MRD7, the core mechanism, the receptor targeting approach, the low-resource delivery design, that is my work. Exactly as I designed it, except they priced it for commercial insurance markets. The people it was designed to reach still cannot afford it. She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at James. The drug that is supposed to help people who cannot access existing diabetes treatments is currently priced at $480 per month, she said. The production cost, based on my original specifications, is $11 per month. The difference is not research and development. The difference is what happens when the purpose of a thing is replaced by the profit of a thing, and the person who designed the purpose has no legal standing to object because she signed a piece of paper at 31 without a lawyer in the room. The office was very quiet. Eleanor was watching James, not Amara. She had heard this before, many times, in the specific iterations that came from 2 years of building a case from the inside out. She knew the content. She was watching to see what the content did to a man who had spent 6 years standing behind Richard Hargrove and had only this morning begun to understand what he had been standing behind. James looked at Amara. Did you know, he said carefully, that they were taking it public? I have known for 14 months, Amara said. The IPO timeline was in a financial publication. I recognized the drug immediately from the description of the mechanism and the lawsuit. Eleanor filed it today because today created conditions that made filing today strategically correct, Amara said. But the lawsuit has been ready for 6 weeks. We were waiting for the right moment. James was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You came to the cafe this morning on purpose, because it is directly below the Meridian Tower." "Yes," Amara said. "And the folder you left on the table was meant to be retrieved in front of witnesses," Amara said. "Yes." James sat with that for a moment. He looked at the window. He looked at Eleanor's bookshelf, at the spines of 30 years of legal work stacked in careful disorder. He looked back at Amara. "You built this for 2 years," he said. And then he walked in and did what he did. And instead of destroying your plan, it just accelerated it, Eleanor said. James nodded slowly. The nod of a man arriving at the end of a very long calculation. "There is something else," he said. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed his phone, opening a folder of files, and placed it on the desk facing Amara. "In the past 6 years, I have been in rooms where things were said that I recorded because it was my job to record them, and because I understood at some point that my employer operated in ways that would eventually require documentation." Eleanor leaned forward. "What kind of things?" she asked. James looked at her steadily. "The kind of things a man says when he believes his security detail is furniture," he said. "Conversations about the MRD7 acquisition, about the 2018 audit flag and why it was deprioritized, about what the legal team was instructed to do if the original researcher ever surfaced with a complaint." Eleanor looked at the phone, then at Amara, then back at James. "Are these recordings admissible?" "Recorded in Illinois," James said. "One-party consent state. I was present in every conversation." Eleanor sat back in her chair with the expression of someone receiving a gift they had not known to ask for, but had needed for a very long time. Amara looked at James with an expression that was not surprise, because she had understood something about him from the moment he had followed her onto the sidewalk that was consistent with what she was hearing now. A man who had spent 17 years carrying a debt he could not repay and had been, without fully realizing it, preparing himself for the moment when repayment became possible. "Why did you record them?" she asked. James was quiet for a moment. "Because," he said finally, "I have spent 6 years working for a man I understood clearly, and understanding him clearly required me to be ready for the day when understanding him clearly became necessary for someone other than myself." He looked at Amara. "I did not know it was going to be you," he said, "but I knew it was going to be someone." The filing hit the federal court docket at 9:47 in the morning. By 10:15, it had been picked up by a legal industry monitoring service subscribed to by every major pharmaceutical analyst on the Eastern Seaboard. By 10:40, 3 financial journalists had requested copies through the court's public access system. By 11, the first story had published a brief, technically precise summary on a pharmaceutical industry wire service that described the suit in careful legal language and mentioned, in its 4th paragraph, that the compound at the center of the dispute was the foundational patent for MRD7. The Meridian pre-IPO share price, traded informally among institutional investors in the weeks before a public offering, dropped 4% in 40 minutes. Eleanor watched the numbers from her desk while Amara sat across from her, and James sat in the second chair, and the 3 of them worked through the recordings on James's phone with the methodical attention of people who understood that what they were listening to would need to withstand the scrutiny of a federal proceeding. There were 11 recordings in total. James had made them over a period of 3 years, using a device small enough to be undetectable and a filing system organized with the same careful discipline he applied to security protocols. He had labeled each file with a date, a location, and a 1-line description of the subject matter. Eleanor read the descriptions aloud as she worked through the folder. MRD7, Acquisition Rationale, Board Discussion, March 2021, 2018 Audit Flag, Legal Team Instruction, September 2021. Researcher Identification Risk, Executive Meeting, January 2022. IPO Disclosure Strategy, Patent Liability, April 2023. She stopped at the 4th entry and looked at James over the top of her reading glasses. "Executive meeting," she said. "Who was present?" "Hargrove, his general counsel, and the head of corporate development," James said. "It was a dinner, private room at Latitude. I was stationed outside the door, The room had poor soundproofing, and I was not given instructions to wait in the corridor rather than immediately adjacent to the entrance. Eleanor's expression did not change, but something in her eyes did. The quality of attention that indicated she was processing something significant. "What did they say about the disclosure strategy?" she asked. James reached over and pressed play on the fourth recording. The audio was imperfect, filtered through a closed door and the ambient noise of a restaurant, but the voices were distinguishable, and the words, in the portions that mattered, were clear enough. Hargrove's voice. "The 2018 flag is a non-issue, as long as the original researcher stays quiet." A second voice, the general counsel. "And if she does not stay quiet?" Hargrove. "Then we spend whatever it costs to make the litigation go away before it touches the offering. That is what the legal reserve is for." Third voice, corporate development. "What if she goes public?" Hargrove. "She is a clinic doctor on a non-profit salary. She does not have the resources to go public in any way that matters." The recording ended. Eleanor pressed stop. She sat with her hands flat on the desk for a moment, which was the closest she ever came to an outward expression of the emotion that professional litigation work required her to keep largely internal. Then she picked up her phone and called her associate in the office next door. "Pull the standard motion for preliminary injunction," she said when he answered. "We are adding an audio exhibit to the evidentiary package. I will send you the files in the next 10 minutes. And call Judge Miriam Walsh's clerk. I want to request an expedited hearing on the injunction motion." She hung up and looked at Amara. "If we get the injunction, the IPO cannot proceed while the patent validity is under active dispute," Eleanor said. "That is a different kind of pressure than a lawsuit. A lawsuit takes time. An injunction takes weeks." Amara nodded. "How quickly can you get the hearing?" James asked. Eleanor looked at the video share count open on the second tab of her browser. 1.8 million views, she said. "A sitting federal judge reads the same news everyone else does. I expect we will be heard within the week." On the 31st floor of Meridian Tower, the emergency board meeting had been called for 11:30 and had begun at 11:22 because 3 of the 7 board members were already in the building and the other 4 had joined by video before the formal start. Time. Priya Sharma presented the situation in the direct, comprehensive manner that had made her effective in her role, and that she suspected was about to make her unemployable at Meridian, regardless of how the next several hours resolved. She laid out the filing, the evidentiary basis as described in the complaint, the 2018 audit flag and its handling, and the recordings, the existence of which had been confirmed to her by the legal team's preliminary review of James Calloway's employment contract, which contained a clause she now understood had been drafted imprecisely enough to create significant ambiguity about recording rights. She did not present solutions. She presented facts. The board could determine what to do with facts. That was what boards were for. When she finished, the room was silent for approximately 6 seconds, which in a board meeting represented a substantial period of time. The lead independent director, a woman named Catherine Holt, who had served on the board for 9 years and had spent the previous hour reading the lawsuit filing on her phone, spoke first. "Where is Richard?" Catherine asked. "In his office," Priya said. "He is aware of the filing. Is he aware of the recordings?" "He is aware that recordings exist," Priya said. "He became aware approximately 30 minutes ago." Catherine looked at the other board members, the particular look of a person who has been in enough institutional crises to recognize the specific shape of one that cannot be managed quietly. "We need outside counsel," she said, "independent of Meridian's legal team. Today." "Agreed," said 2 board members simultaneously. "And we need to discuss Richard's status," Catherine continued. "Given the video, the filing, and the evidentiary questions around the 2018 audit, I do not think we can allow him to continue in an executive capacity during an active federal proceeding without creating additional liability for this board." The room absorbed this. No one disagreed. Sophia Reyes had posted the video at 10:03 in the morning, 47 minutes after the incident, after sitting with the question of whether to post it for the full duration of that time, and concluding that the answer was yes for the same reason she had filmed it in the first place. Because witnessing something and choosing silence were not the same as not being present for it, and she did not want to be the kind of person who treated her own discomfort as a sufficient reason to keep the truth from people who deserve to see it. She had posted it with a 3-sentence caption that described what she had observed, where it had happened, and the name of the man in the video, which she had confirmed through a 30-second search after recognizing his face from a business magazine cover she had processed paperwork for at her firm 6 months earlier. By noon, the video had been viewed 2.4 million times. By 1 in the afternoon, 7 of the original Café witnesses had posted their own accounts, independently and without coordination, each describing the same sequence of events from their respective vantage points in the room. Their accounts were consistent in every material detail. The barista, whose collision with a colleague had caused the original spill, had posted a brief statement identifying herself and confirming that she had caused the spill and that Dr. Osei had been standing at her table when it occurred and had made no contact with Hargrove or his coffee. By 2 in the afternoon, the story had moved from financial industry publications to general news outlets. By 3, it had reached the kind of national attention that produces calls to publicists and statements from organizations that had previously had no connection to any of the parties involved. Danny Calloway, watching from his apartment in Evanston, saw his father's name mentioned in the 3rd paragraph of a news article at 2:47 in the afternoon. He read the paragraph twice. Then he booked a flight to Chicago, departing at 6:15, packed a bag in 11 minutes, and called his father from the rideshare to the airport. "Dad," he said when James answered. "I am coming." "I know," James said. "She knows too." A pause on the line. "Is she okay?" Danny asked. "Danny," James said, and his voice carried something that his son had not heard in it for a very long time. "She was okay before any of this started. That is the whole point." Richard Hargrove had spent 30 years building a specific relationship with consequence. The relationship was simple. Consequences happened to other people. They happened to people who made mistakes, who were careless, who failed to anticipate. They happened to employees who underperformed, and vendors who overpromised, and competitors who underestimated the resources Hargrove could deploy when he decided something needed to be resolved. In 30 years of building Meridian from a regional operation into a billion-dollar enterprise, Hargrove had navigated regulatory investigations, shareholder disputes, 2 hostile takeover attempts, and a product liability case that had taken 4 years and $14 million to settle. He had navigated all of it from the position of a man who understood that resources and patience and the right legal team could outlast almost any challenge that came from outside. He had never seriously considered what it would look like when the challenge came from inside. He was at his desk at 2 in the afternoon when Catherine Holt called him directly, which she had not done in the 9 years she had served on his board. The call lasted 4 minutes. She told him, in the measured language of a board member who had been well counseled in the past 3 hours, that effective, immediately he was being placed on administrative leave, pending the board's independent review of the matters raised in the federal filing and the associated evidentiary questions that had come to the board's attention that morning. Hargrove said 3 things in those 4 minutes. He said this was premature. He said the lawsuit was without merit. He said he expected the board to support management through a legally contested period rather than capitulating to public pressure. Catherine listened to all 3 without interruption. Then she said, calmly and without inflection, "Richard, we have heard the recording from Latitude. All of it. Outside counsel has advised us that the board cannot maintain its fiduciary responsibilities while you remain in an executive capacity during this proceeding. This is not a decision we made lightly, and it is not one we are prepared to revisit today. Your access credentials will be suspended at 4 o'clock. The line was quiet for a moment. Hargrove said, "You will regret this." Catherine said, "I expect the relevant parties will be in touch through appropriate legal channels." Then she ended the call. Hargrove's press statement was released at 3:15, drafted by his personal publicist in the 2 hours between the board call and the 4 o'clock credential suspension, circulated to media contacts in advance of what everyone understood was coming. It described the lawsuit as a meritless, opportunistic claim by a former university researcher seeking to capitalize on Meridian's success. It characterized the patent transfer as a standard institutional transaction conducted through proper channels with full legal oversight. It described the video as an unfortunate interaction that had been mischaracterized and taken out of context, and noted that Hargrove had attempted to address a genuine misunderstanding with a customer who had responded with disproportionate escalation. The statement used the phrase out of context twice and the phrase misunderstanding 3 times. It did not mention the recordings. The media response was immediate and comprehensive. Within 40 minutes, 5 journalists who had spent the afternoon reviewing the federal filing and cross-referencing the 2018 audit documentation had published detailed rebuttals of specific claims in the statement. The phrase full legal oversight was particularly scrutinized, given the complaint's specific allegation that no independent legal counsel had been present for the original researcher at the time of the patent transfer, a fact the statement did not address. By 4:33, pharmaceutical industry analysts had revised their commentary on the Meridian IPO from cautious optimism to active concern. One used the phrase material uncertainty. Another used the phrase fundamental valuation question. The third simply wrote that the IPO was effectively on hold pending the resolution of a dispute that went to the core of the company's most valuable asset. The underwriting bank issued a brief statement at 5 o'clock, noting that it was reviewing the situation and would provide updated guidance to investors in due course. In the specific language of investment banking, this meant that the IPO was not proceeding on its current timeline. James Calloway submitted his formal resignation from Meridian Security Services at 3:45 via email to the head of HR and copied to Catherine Holt, with a brief note that stated his reasons plainly and without elaboration. He had been present for conduct inconsistent with the duties of his position and inconsistent with his own professional standards. He had addressed those inconsistencies in the manner available to him. He was resigning effective immediately and would cooperate fully with any legal proceedings that required his participation. He sent the email from the parking structure across from Copper Hall, sitting in his personal vehicle, which he had been using that morning rather than the company car. Then he drove to O'Hare. Danny's flight landed at 8:22. James was at the arrivals level when his son came through the doors, and for a moment he simply looked at him, 36 years old now, broad-shouldered, moving through the crowd with the particular gait of a man who had learned to navigate difficult terrain and never entirely stopped walking that way. Danny spotted him and crossed the distance between them without slowing down, and James, who had maintained composure through a sequence of events that would have unmade most people, found that the sight of his son walking toward him in an airport terminal at 8:22 on a Tuesday night was the thing that finally exceeded his capacity for containment. They stood in the arrivals hall for a moment, the two of them, while the crowd moved around them with its ordinary indifference. "She agreed to meet you," James said, when he could speak evenly. Danny nodded. His jaw was tight in a way that James recognized from the hospital in Germany 17 years ago, the specific tightness of a person managing an emotion too large for the space it was being asked to occupy. "Tomorrow?" Danny asked. "Tomorrow," James said. "At the clinic. She will be there by 6. Danny looked at his father. "How is she?" he asked. The same question he had asked on the phone from the rideshare, because it was the only question that mattered to him, and he had not yet received an answer that felt sufficient. James thought about Amara in the cafe that morning, her chin lifted, her voice steady, her eyes on Hargrove's face with the composure of someone who had already decided, long before the morning required it of her, who she was going to be in that moment. He thought about her in Eleanor's office, 3 hours later, laying out 4 years of research and 2 years of legal preparation, with the same quiet precision she had used to guide a wounded soldier through a field surgery in a tent with no electricity. He thought about the MSF badge on her necklace, worn smooth at the edges from 17 years of handling, and what it meant to carry a reminder not of what you had achieved, but of what you had decided to be. "She is exactly who she was in that tent," James said. Danny was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his bag and they walked toward the exit together. Father and son, the airport moving around them with its ordinary noise, the city outside waiting with its ordinary darkness, and somewhere on the south side, in a one-bedroom apartment above a parking lot, a woman with a silver necklace and a worn folder, and 4 years of documented truth was asleep by 10 o'clock the way she always was, because the alarm was set for 5:15, and there were patients at the clinic by 6, and the work did not stop because the day had been eventful. The work never stopped. That was the whole point. The preliminary injunction hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. Judge Miriam Walsh had been on the federal bench for 19 years and had presided over patent disputes involving pharmaceutical companies on 4 previous occasions, which meant she came to the hearing with a working understanding of both the technical complexity of the subject matter and the specific ways in which large corporations manage the gap between what their legal filings said and what their internal communications revealed. She had read the complaint overnight on Tuesday, reviewed the audio recordings on Wednesday morning, and arrived at the hearing on Thursday with the expression of a judge who had already done the work and was present to hear whether anything in the room would alter what the documents had already told her. It did not take long. Meridian's outside counsel, a senior partner from a firm that had handled pharmaceutical patent litigation for 20 years, presented their opposition to the injunction with the polished precision of someone arguing a position they privately understood to be significantly weaker than the one facing them across the aisle. He cited the institutional validity of the original transfer agreement, the university's legal authority to enter into the transaction, and the chain of development work Meridian had conducted subsequent to the acquisition. Eleanor Tran spent 11 minutes in response. She did not raise her voice. She did not use language designed to produce emotion in the room. She presented the 2018 audit flag and its deliberate deprioritization. She played 40 seconds of the Latitude recording. She submitted the complete chain of internal correspondence that Priya Sharma's USB drive had contained, which documented with the specificity of people who believed their communications were private, exactly how Meridian's legal team had assessed and managed the risk of the original researcher's potential claim over a period of 3 years. She concluded by noting that MRD7's current pricing structure bore no relationship to the low resource delivery design that constituted the foundational innovation of the compound, and that this divergence was not incidental, but documented in internal strategy communications as a deliberate commercial decision made with full knowledge of the original research intent. Judge Walsh granted the preliminary injunction at 11:40 in the morning. The Meridian IPO was formally suspended at 1:15. The settlement negotiations began 3 weeks later and concluded in 6. Amara had one condition that was not subject to negotiation, and Eleanor had communicated it in the first meeting with Meridian's outside counsel in terms that made clear it was the condition on which everything else depended. Full reversion of the MRD7 patent to Amara, plus the right to license it under terms she set, plus damages calculated on the basis of Meridian's projected IPO valuation of the compound. The damages figure, after 6 weeks of negotiation, conducted with the particular exhausting precision of 2 legal teams, who both understood the evidentiary landscape and were calculating from it toward a number that would end the proceeding, settled at $47 million. Amara received the wire confirmation on a Friday morning, sitting at her desk at the Southside Community Health Center, between a 7 o'clock patient and an 8 o'clock one. She looked at the number on her screen for approximately 30 seconds. Then she opened the file she had been working on for the past 3 weeks and continued building the documentation for the OSE Foundation, which Eleanor had helped her incorporate during the settlement period, dedicated to providing legal support for researchers from underrepresented backgrounds who had experienced intellectual property displacement through institutional transfer agreements conducted without independent counsel. The clinic's operating fund received the first allocation the following Monday, enough to cover 2 years of operating costs at current capacity, with sufficient reserve to expand to a second location on the west side that Amara had been assessing for 18 months. The MRD7 licensing agreement went to 3 pharmaceutical manufacturers simultaneously, with production specifications that brought the per-month cost to patients without insurance to $14, $3 above Amara's original production estimate, an increase she had accepted to allow for quality control measures she considered non-negotiable. The drug reached the first patients through the Southside Clinic 6 months later. Amara administered the first prescription herself to a 63-year-old retired sanitation worker named Gerald Porter, who had been managing type 2 diabetes with a medication regimen that cost him $220 a month and left him choosing, with some regularity, between medication and groceries. He looked at the prescription printout for a moment, then at Amara. $14, he said. $14, she confirmed. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his jacket pocket, and Amara moved to her next patient, and the morning continued. The way mornings at the clinic always continued, without ceremony and without pause, because the work did not accommodate either. Richard Hargrove faced civil charges related to the patent fraud, the 2018 audit suppression, and a separate filing connected to the physical assault in Copper Hall. His legal team negotiated the civil matters over the course of 8 months. He did not return to an executive role at Meridian, which underwent restructuring under new leadership and eventually completed a substantially reduced IPO 14 months after the original filing had been suspended. He gave no public interviews during that period. He issued no further statements. The publicist who had drafted the out-of-context press release resigned from his account 2 weeks after the statement was published, citing irreconcilable differences regarding communication strategy, which in publicist language meant that she had read the Latitude recording transcript and concluded that the context was in fact entirely available. Priya Sharma left Meridian the week after the board meeting and joined a healthcare consulting firm that specialized in pharmaceutical compliance. She submitted a detailed voluntary statement to the federal proceeding that corroborated the documentary evidence and described her discovery of the MRD7 acquisition file with a precision that suggested she had been composing the statement in her head for longer than the week it took to write it down. James Calloway joined the OSE Foundation's Board of Advisors in January, the first board he had ever served on, a fact he mentioned to Amara during their second conversation at the clinic, and that she received with the same quiet nod she used for most things that did not require more than a nod. He drove Danny to the South Side on a Sunday in November, 4 weeks after the settlement, for a visit that had no agenda and no schedule, and that lasted 3 hours because Danny kept finding reasons not to leave. Danny sat in the waiting room of the clinic after the formal conversation had concluded, and Amara had been called to see a patient, and he looked at the walls, which had the particular aesthetic of a space that had been decorated by people who cared about the patients more than the appearance. Children's drawings alongside laminated health information, a bulletin board dense with community announcements, a plant near the window that was thriving in a way that suggested consistent and deliberate attention. When Amara came back, Danny stood up. "There is something I've been trying to say for 17 years, he said. Amara looked at him with the expression James had come to recognize as her version of patience, which was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of enough steadiness to allow feeling to arrive at its own pace. "You do not have to say it," she said. "I know." Danny was quiet for a moment. "I know you know," he said. "I need to say it anyway. For me," she nodded. So he said it. What he said was not something James could fully hear from where he was standing near the entrance. And he did not try to move closer, because some things are said between two people and belong to both of them and to no one else. And the debt that Danny had carried for 17 years had always been between him and the woman who had refused to let him die in a tent in Kandahar. And the repayment of it, whatever form it took in the 3 minutes they stood in the hallway of a Southside clinic on a Sunday in November, belonged to them in the same way. What James could see was Amara's face, and what he saw on it, briefly and without performance, was the expression of a person receiving something they had not known they needed until it arrived. She walked them out at noon, down the corridor and through the waiting room and out the front door into the November light. She stood on the sidewalk while they got into the car, and James lowered the window. "Same time next Sunday?" he asked. She looked at him with the small, specific expression that served her as a smile. "I will be here at 6, she said. "Same as always." She went back inside. The clinic was already full. Amara Osei never asked to be seen. She asked only to do the work, in whatever room the work required, wearing whatever she happened to own, carrying whatever reminder she needed to remember who she had decided to be. The people who judged her by her coat and her bag and the color of her skin did not see a threat. They saw an absence of importance. They were wrong about both things. The most dangerous person in any room is not the loudest one. It is the one who has already done the work before the room knew it needed doing. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell us where in the world you are watching from. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. And share this one for everyone who has ever been looked through instead of looked at. They are seen. They have always been seen.